Tiny Atlas should have been asleep, but somehow he knew the war had followed Caleb Rowe back into the room. The barracks at Camp Lejeune were quiet under the low blue wash of the emergency lights, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel too honest. A ceiling fan turned slowly above the rows of bunks. Somewhere down the hall, a pipe clicked behind the wall. Outside, beyond the screened windows, the North Carolina night smelled of wet grass, pine, and distant ocean air drifting in from miles away. Most of the Marines slept without moving, boots lined beneath their racks, uniforms folded with practiced care, their breathing steady in the dark. But Caleb was not steady. He lay on his back in the bottom bunk, white knuckles tangled in the thin government blanket, his jaw tight, his pale face damp with sweat. He was 34, broad-shouldered, close-cropped, the kind of man who looked as if discipline had been carved into him before tenderness ever had a chance. In daylight, Sergeant Caleb Rowe moved through the base like a locked door. He gave orders cleanly. He kept his locker perfect. He answered concern with a nod and silence. But sleep had a way of finding the rooms a man kept hidden. Tonight, his breath came short. His eyes moved beneath closed lids. One hand reached across the mattress, searching for something that was not there anymore. Then, at the foot of the bunk, a small shadow stirred. Atlas was barely big enough to climb the first step without effort. A young German shepherd with oversized paws, sable fur, and one ear that had not fully decided to stand straight. During the day, he looked like a mistake wandering through military order, too small for the concrete, too curious for the rules, too soft for a place built on commands. But now he stood perfectly still. His amber eyes watched Caleb with a seriousness no puppy should have known. He did not bark. He did not whine for attention. He waited, listening to the broken rhythm of Caleb's breathing as if it were a radio signal only he could hear. Caleb's fingers tightened around the chain at his neck, the old dog tag he wore beneath his shirt, the one that did not belong to him alone. Atlas stepped closer. His nails made tiny taps against the floor, almost swallowed by the fan. Caleb turned sharply in the blanket, caught somewhere between memory and the present, and a faint sound escaped him. Not a word, not a cry, just the sound of a man trying not to fall apart where anyone could see. Atlas rose on his back legs and placed two small paws against the edge of the mattress. He slipped once, scrambled, tried again, stubborn as sunrise. When he finally pulled himself onto the bunk, he crawled carefully across the blanket and pressed his warm body against Caleb's chest. The Marine's eyes opened. For one breath, he did not know where he was. Then he felt fur under his hand, small ribs rising and falling, a living heartbeat refusing to leave. Atlas lowered his head and gently nudged the chain from Caleb's clenched fist. Not hard, not playful, gentle, as if returning something sacred. Caleb stared at him in the dark. The room was still the barracks. The fan still turned. The others still slept. But the nightmare had loosened its grip, and in the quiet space it left behind, a tiny dog with crooked ears looked up at him like he had crossed miles of shadow just to bring him home. Morning came softly, as if the night had never happened. A thin gray light slid through the barracks windows and touched the floor in long, quiet strips. The first whistle sounded outside before sunrise, sharp enough to stir every rack at once. Marines sat up, boots hit concrete, lockers opened, belts snapped, and the familiar rhythm of Camp Lejeune returned like a machine remembering its purpose. Caleb Rowe was already awake. He sat on the edge of his bunk with his elbows on his knees, the old chain resting against his palm, his eyes fixed on the floor as if the answers were hidden somewhere between the scuffed tiles and his boots. Atlas slept beside one boot, curled into a comma of sable fur, nose tucked under his tail, one oversized paw resting on Caleb's lace, as if making sure the man did not leave without permission. Caleb looked down at him and tried to feel annoyed. He failed. Across the aisle, Lance Corporal Briggs stopped buttoning his blouse and stared. "Sergeant," he said carefully, "there is a dog on your boot." Caleb did not look up. "That is not my dog." Atlas opened one amber eye, gave a tiny sigh, and placed his chin more firmly across the boot. Briggs pressed his lips together, fighting a grin. "He appears to disagree." Caleb stood, gently sliding his foot free. Atlas woke at once, popped up too fast, stumbled over his own front paws, and sneezed directly at the polished toe of Caleb's boot. Three Marines turned away to hide their laughter. Caleb reached for his cover and spoke with the flat calm of a man trying to restore order to a situation that had already defeated him. Somebody find out who brought him in. Nobody answered. Not because they were disobeying, but because every man in the room had seen that puppy follow Caleb since yesterday afternoon, through the side gate, past the motor pool, across the parade deck, and all the way to the barracks like he had been given orders from somewhere higher than command. By 0600 hours, the base was fully awake. The sky over North Carolina had turned pale blue, and the damp grass along the walkways glittered beneath the early sun. Diesel fumes drifted from the motor pool. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Boots struck pavement in clean rhythm as platoons moved between buildings. Caleb walked with his usual measured stride, shoulders squared, jaw set, uniform sharp enough to make younger Marines straighten without being told. 6 feet behind him, Atlas trotted with absolute confidence, ears bouncing, tail high, trying to match the pace of a man whose legs were much longer than his own. Every few steps, the puppy had to hurry into a clumsy little hop. "Row," Staff Sergeant Miller called from outside the admin building, arms folded, eyebrows raised. "You running a new recruit program I did not hear about?" Caleb stopped. Atlas stopped too, but because he was watching Caleb instead of the sidewalk, he sat down halfway on Caleb's left boot. A low laugh moved through the Marines nearby. Caleb glanced down slowly. Atlas looked up, proud and breathless, as if awaiting evaluation. "He is not with me," Caleb said. Miller looked from the puppy to Caleb, then back again. "He is sitting on your foot. That is his decision." Miller's mouth twitched. "Take him to veterinary services before he wanders into training." Caleb exhaled through his nose, the closest thing he allowed to a sigh. He crouched, picked Atlas up beneath the chest, and held him away from his uniform. The puppy dangled with complete trust, tail wagging in the air. For a second, something in Caleb's face shifted. It was small, almost invisible, but there. A softening. Then he locked it away. "Come on. Little problem," he muttered. Atlas responded by licking the edge of his sleeve. The walk to the base veterinary office should have taken 4 minutes. It took 11. Atlas became fascinated by a line of ants, then a dropped glove, then the reflection of a Humvee windshield. Twice he tried to carry a pine cone bigger than his mouth. Once he stopped in front of a formation of Marines and sat at attention, crooked ear tilted forward, so solemn that even the drill instructor had to turn his face before he smiled. Caleb stood there, one hand on his hip, watching the entire base fall in love with the one creature he was determined not to keep. At the veterinary office, a civilian technician named Mara Ellison knelt to examine Atlas, her hands gentle, her voice warm. Male German Shepherd, young, maybe 10 weeks, no collar, no microchip showing on the first scan. Atlas chewed the corner of the paper exam sheet while staring at Caleb. Mara smiled. "He seems attached." Caleb kept his eyes on the window. "He followed me by accident." "Across half the base?" "Persistent accident." Mara laughed softly. But when Caleb finally turned back, Atlas had stopped chewing. He was watching him with that same strange focus from the night before, as if beneath all the puppy clumsiness there was an old, quiet promise already forming. Caleb felt the chain beneath his shirt grow heavy. He looked away first. Mara Ellison kept Atlas at the veterinary office until after lunch, which should have solved the problem. Caleb told himself that twice on the walk back to the admin building, then once more while signing equipment forms he barely read. The puppy was safe. The puppy was not his. The puppy would be turned over to the proper unit, checked, fed, and placed somewhere sensible, somewhere far away from a Marine who woke up reaching for memories he could not put down. That was the rule Caleb made inside himself. Rules were clean. Rules did not whimper in the dark. Rules did not press a warm head under your chin and make the room feel less haunted. By 1300 hours, the sun had burned through the morning haze and laid a white glare across the parade deck. Heat rose from the concrete in shimmering waves. Caleb crossed from the supply office toward the motor pool with a clipboard under one arm, his expression still enough to discourage conversation. A forklift beeped in reverse near the warehouse. Somewhere beyond the fence, cicadas droned in the pine trees. Everything was normal until a young private near the fuel shed suddenly froze and pointed. "Sergeant Rowe," he said, voice caught between warning and laughter. "Your persistent accident is back." Caleb stopped walking. Across the lot, trotting beneath the shadow of a parked Humvee, came Atlas. He had somehow acquired a strip of white gauze around one front paw like a tiny field dressing, though he did not seem hurt in the slightest. His tail wagged so hard his whole back end swayed. When he saw Caleb, his ears lifted, one straight, one crooked, and he broke into a clumsy run. "No," Caleb said under his breath. Atlas came faster. "Absolutely not." Atlas reached him, sat down directly on the toe of his boot, and looked up as if reporting for duty. The private coughed into his fist. Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. "Who let him out?" Mara appeared moments later from the direction of the clinic, slightly breathless, holding an empty leash. "He let himself out," she said. "That kennel latch was not designed for someone with paws and determination." Caleb looked down at Atlas. Atlas looked innocent, not convincingly, but with commitment. Mara knelt and adjusted the loose gauze. "He is healthy, hungry, stubborn. No chip, no records. I called 2 local shelters and base housing. Nobody has reported a missing puppy." Caleb kept his voice even. "Then follow protocol." "I am trying," Mara said gently. "Protocol keeps following you." A few Marines nearby laughed, but not cruelly. It was the kind of laughter that came when something soft slipped into a hard day and nobody knew how badly they needed it. Caleb hated that he heard it. He hated more that he did not mind. He handed his clipboard to the private and reached for the leash. Atlas leaned away from it, then ducked behind Caleb's boot. Mara lifted an eyebrow. "Interesting." "It is not interesting. He does not trust the leash yet. But he trusts you." Caleb felt those words settle somewhere he had not invited them. He crouched slowly, keeping his movements calm. Atlas peeked around the boot, nose twitching. "Listen," Caleb murmured, so low only the puppy could hear. "I have work. I am not your person." Atlas stepped forward and placed one paw on Caleb's knee. Small, warm, certain. For a moment, Caleb saw the barracks again. Blue light, shaking hands, a chain being loosened from his fist. He swallowed and stood too quickly. "I will walk him back," he said. But Atlas had other plans. The moment Caleb turned toward the clinic, Atlas trotted beside him for 6 feet, then veered toward the training yard where Marines were running drills. He slid under a rope barrier, stumbled through a patch of sand, and stopped beside a row of seated Marines awaiting instruction. Then, with the seriousness of a seasoned recruit, he sat in line. Not straight, not correctly spaced, but proud. The instructor opened his mouth to bark a command, saw the puppy staring up with full attention, and lost the fight against a smile. "Private Atlas," Briggs called from the back. "Your cover is missing." The yard broke into quiet laughter. Caleb should have been embarrassed. Instead, he stood at the edge of the sand with the leash in his hand, watching a tiny German shepherd turn a military drill into something almost holy, because for 30 seconds every tired face softened. Atlas glanced back at him, tail sweeping the dust. Caleb did not smile fully. Not yet. But the corner of his mouth betrayed him just enough for Briggs to notice. And for the first time in a long time, no one looked at Caleb Rowe like he was broken. They looked at him like he was being found. By mid-afternoon, the entire corner of Camp Lejeune seemed to know about the small German shepherd who had appointed himself to Sergeant Caleb Rowe. Word moved faster than any official memo. It passed through the motor pool with the smell of oil and hot rubber, crossed the chow hall on the steam of coffee and scrambled eggs, slipped into the admin office with stacks of unsigned forms, and reached the training yard before Caleb could pretend he had control of the situation. Atlas became a rumor with paws. Some Marines claimed he could open doors. Others said he only followed men with haunted eyes. Briggs said nothing at all when Caleb glared at him, but he had already started calling the puppy Private Atlas under his breath. The name stuck by 1,500 hours. Caleb did not approve it. No one asked him to. Atlas spent the afternoon turning strict routine into a series of small mercies nobody had planned for. During gear inspection, he wandered between 2 rows of boots, stopped in front of Caleb's polished pair, and barked once at his own reflection in the shine. The sound was sharp, offended, and deeply sincere. A corporal nearly dropped his canteen, trying not to laugh. Caleb knelt, took Atlas gently by the shoulders, and turned him away from the boots. "That enemy has been neutralized," he said. Atlas sneezed. The line broke. Even Miller covered his mouth and looked toward the tree line as if studying national security. Later, outside the laundry room, Atlas emerged dragging one of Caleb's white athletic socks like it was a captured flag. The sock was twice as long as his head and trailed behind him across the sidewalk. Caleb stepped out of the barracks just in time to see 6 Marines standing in a semicircle, silently watching the puppy parade past with terrible pride. Atlas saw Caleb, froze, and lifted his chin higher. Caleb held out one hand. "Drop it." Atlas blinked. The sock remained firmly in his mouth. "Atlas." At the sound of his name, the puppy's tail started wagging, which made the sock swing from side to side like a surrender banner. Briggs whispered, "He is negotiating, Sergeant." Caleb took 2 slow steps forward. Atlas took 2 slow steps back. What followed was not a chase, because Caleb Rowe did not chase puppies in front of Marines. It was, officially, a controlled tactical recovery of personal property. It ended when Atlas tried to hide beneath a bench, forgot he had grown just enough to get stuck halfway, and gave Caleb a look of quiet betrayal. Caleb crouched, freed him carefully, and took back the sock. For one brief second, the puppy leaned his head against Caleb's wrist. The laughter faded around them. Caleb felt the softness of that moment before he could stop it. He cleared his throat and stood. Back to work. But the day had already changed. At the briefing room, Atlas slipped inside behind a pair of boots and chose the worst possible place to nap, directly beneath the front table where Caleb stood reviewing the evening roster. The room smelled of old coffee, dry erase markers, and rain beginning somewhere beyond the windows. Caleb spoke in his steady voice, pointing to the board. "Tomorrow morning, first formation will begin at 0530 hours. Any questions?" From beneath the table came a tiny, sleepy bark. The timing was perfect. The room went still. Then a wave of laughter rolled through the Marines, quiet at first, then impossible to hold back. Caleb stared straight ahead, jaw tight, but his ears turned faintly red. Miller leaned back in his chair. "Private Atlas has a question." Caleb looked down. Atlas was flat on his belly, chin on his paws, one crooked ear lifted as if he were awaiting clarification. For the first time all day, Caleb let the silence breathe. Then he said, "The answer is no." Atlas yawned. The room laughed again, warmer this time, not at Caleb, not at the puppy, but at the strange grace of an ordinary afternoon becoming something they would remember. When evening settled over the base, the sky turned the color of cooled steel, and the first porch lights along the barracks flickered on. Caleb walked back alone, or tried to. Atlas padded beside him, tired now, paws dusty, tail lower but still wagging whenever Caleb glanced down. The puppy had spent the day making a mess of order, and somehow he had repaired something no one had dared touch. Caleb stopped near the steps and looked toward the darkening parade deck. For a moment, he listened to the soft sounds of base life winding down, distant voices, a closing truck door, the flag rope tapping gently against the pole. Atlas sat against his boot without being told. Caleb looked down at him and spoke quietly. "You are trouble." Atlas leaned into his leg. Caleb's hand moved before his pride could stop it, resting once between the puppy's ears. "But you are quiet trouble." The words disappeared into the evening air, small and unguarded, and Atlas accepted them like a promise. By the time the evening mess had cleared and the last orange line of sunset faded behind the pine trees, Caleb Rowe had almost convinced himself that the day had been harmless. A puppy had stolen a sock. A room full of Marines had laughed. Mara Ellison had left a folded note on his desk saying temporary observation approved for 48 hours, which Caleb read 3 times with the same expression a man might give an unexploded problem. Atlas was asleep beneath the bench outside the barracks, paws twitching, nose dusty, body curled around Caleb's boot as if the boot were government-issued shelter. The air had cooled. The base had quieted into its night sounds, generators humming low, insects singing in the grass, a distant truck rolling somewhere beyond the motor pool. Caleb sat on the wooden steps with his elbows on his knees and the old chain looped through his fingers. The dog tag caught the porch light each time it turned, a small dull flash against his palm. It belonged to his best friend, Corporal Daniel Hayes, though Caleb never said the name out loud unless he had to. Some names were not spoken. They were carried. Daniel had been the kind of Marine who made cold coffee taste like a joke and bad weather feel temporary. He had been 29, from Ohio, with a laugh that could fill a barracks and a habit of tapping 2 fingers against his chest before every hard day. as if reminding his heart to stay in the fight. Caleb had kept the tag after the last deployment, not as a memorial exactly, but as a promise he did not know how to finish. Since coming home, he had learned how to stand in formation without shaking. He had learned how to answer questions with short sentences. He had learned how to be useful, but he had not learned how to sleep. Atlas stirred beneath the bench and crawled out, blinking at the dim light. He padded over slowly this time, without the clumsy parade of the afternoon. He stopped a few inches from Caleb's boot and sat, waiting. Caleb looked down at him. "You should be tired," he said. Atlas tilted his crooked ear. Caleb gave a faint breath that was not quite a laugh. "Yeah, me too." The puppy placed his chin on the edge of the step. He did not jump. He did not paw. He simply stayed close, as if he understood that some doors had to open from the inside. Caleb turned the dog tag between his fingers. The metal was worn smooth along one edge from years of touch. "I used to be good at this," he murmured. His voice was so low the night nearly swallowed it. Getting through the day, keeping people steady, knowing what to do next. Atlas watched him with unblinking amber eyes. Caleb swallowed. Then one day, everybody came home different. And I came home with his tag. The words settled in the warm dark. No one corrected him. No one told him to move on. No one tried to turn grief into a lesson. Atlas just rose, took one careful step forward, and rested his small head on Caleb's boot. It was such a simple thing that Caleb nearly looked away. Instead, his hand lowered until his fingers brushed the soft fur between the puppy's ears. The base remained quiet around them, wide and sleeping, but Caleb felt something shift in the stillness. Not healing. Not yet. More like the first crack in a locked window. Air getting in. He looked toward the barracks door, where rows of bunks waited under the blue night lights, and the old fear moved through him again. Sleep was not rest for Caleb. Sleep was a road back to places he had already left. Atlas seemed to feel the change before Caleb moved. The puppy lifted his head and pressed closer to his leg. Caleb stared at him for a long moment, then whispered the truth like a confession. "I'm scared to close my eyes." Atlas answered by climbing awkwardly onto the step beside him, turning in a small circle and settling against Caleb's thigh with all the weight his tiny body could offer. Caleb did not cry then. He only sat very still, one hand on the dog tag, one hand on the puppy, listening to the night breathe around them. And for the first time since coming back to Camp Lejeune, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like someone was keeping watch. Caleb lasted almost 40 minutes before sleep finally took him. He did not remember lying down. He only remembered setting the dog tag on the small metal shelf beside the bunk, then leaving one hand low enough for Atlas to smell before the puppy curled into the blanket near his boots. The barracks had gone quiet in layers. First the conversations faded, then the last locker shut, then the hallway lights dimmed, leaving only the soft blue glow that turned every bunk into a shadowed outline. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows, not hard, just steady, a patient sound falling through the dark. Caleb breathed through it. In for 4 counts. Out for 4. Again. Again. Atlas slept lightly at the foot of the bunk, ears twitching at every shift in the room. For a while, nothing happened. Then Caleb's fingers moved. Not much, just a tightening against the sheet. His breathing changed next, losing its rhythm, breaking into shallow pulls. His shoulders drew inward, as if the mattress beneath him had become unstable ground. Atlas opened his eyes before any human in the room stirred. The puppy lifted his head, listening. Rain. Fan. Distant pipes. Caleb's breath. That was the sound that mattered. Atlas rose slowly, placing each paw with care. He stepped over Caleb's ankle and moved toward his chest, but Caleb turned hard beneath the blanket, caught in a place where no one could follow with words. His hand reached toward the shelf and closed around the chain before he was fully awake. The dog tag slid into his fist. His face tightened. A faint murmur left him, soft and broken, a name shaped more by grief than sound. Atlas froze. The little German shepherd did not bark. Some part of him seemed to know that loudness would only deepen the dark. Instead, he pressed his nose against Caleb's wrist. Caleb did not wake. His fist clenched around the tag until the chain pulled tight across his knuckles. Atlas nudged again, firmer this time. Then he climbed onto Caleb's chest with awkward determination, his paws slipping once on the blanket before he found balance. He was small, barely more than warmth and heartbeat, but he settled his whole weight there, ribs rising against ribs, breath answering breath. Caleb's breathing hitched. Atlas lowered his head under Caleb's chin and stayed still. The rain tapped the glass. Somewhere across the room, Briggs shifted in his sleep but did not wake. Caleb's eyes opened suddenly, wide and unfocused, staring past the ceiling into a memory that was already fading. For a second, his body remained locked. Then he felt the puppy, the small weight, the warm fur, the steady breathing pressed to his own. Atlas lifted his head and touched his nose to Caleb's jaw. Caleb blinked. Once, twice. The barracks returned slowly. Blue light, metal bunks, wet pine smell through the window, a puppy on his chest, refusing to move. Caleb looked down, and the tension in his hand began to loosen. Atlas noticed. Carefully, he reached his mouth toward the chain, not biting, not pulling hard, just catching it with the gentlest pressure. He eased the dog tag from Caleb's fist and let it fall against the blanket between them. Caleb stared at the small piece of metal. His throat moved. No speech came. Atlas placed one paw beside the tag, as if guarding it from the nightmare itself. Then he rested his head over Caleb's heart. That broke something open, but not violently. Quietly, like a door unlatching after years of being held shut. Caleb lifted one shaking hand and laid it across Atlas's back. The puppy's fur was warm under his palm. Real. Present. Alive. Caleb drew one long breath, deeper than the last, and the darkness inside him gave back an inch. Not there, he whispered. His voice barely touched the air. I am not there. Atlas answered with a small sigh and pressed closer. Caleb closed his eyes again, not to sleep, not yet, but to feel the truth of the room around him. The rain was rain. The fan was a fan. The heartbeat against his chest belonged to a 10-week-old German shepherd who had somehow learned the shape of his fear before anyone taught him a command. And in that blue quiet, while the rest of the barracks slept, Caleb understood that Atlas had not followed him through the base because he was lost. He had followed because Caleb was. Caleb did not sleep again that night, but he did not panic either. He stayed on his back beneath the thin barracks blanket, one hand resting over Atlas's small body, listening to the rain soften against the glass. Every so often, the puppy breathed a little deeper, his paw twitching once as if chasing something gentle in a dream. Caleb watched the blue light gather along the edge of the metal shelf where Daniel's dog tag lay quiet now, no longer trapped in his fist. It looked different outside the grip of fear. Smaller, sadder, holy in the way ordinary things become holy when they are all that remains of someone loved. Caleb reached for it slowly. Atlas lifted his head at once, alert, amber eyes shining in the dim room. Easy, Caleb whispered. I am all right. The word surprised him. He had said that phrase 100 times to officers, to medics, to friends who asked too carefully, but this was the first time it sounded almost true. He picked up the tag and turned it in his fingers. The chain slid softly across his palm. Atlas crawled higher, pressing his nose beneath Caleb's wrist, not stopping him, only staying close enough to remind him of the room. Caleb looked down at the puppy and felt his chest tighten, not from terror this time, but from the ache of being seen without having to explain. His name was Daniel, Caleb said. The barracks remained still. Corporal Daniel Hayes. He hated powdered eggs. Sang off-key every Sunday. Could fix a radio with a paper clip and bad attitude. A weak breath left Caleb, nearly a laugh, nearly something else. Atlas blinked, serious and silent, as if every word deserved his full attention. Caleb rubbed his thumb over the stamped letters on the metal. He told me once that if I ever got too quiet, somebody needed to bother me until I came back. His voice thinned. Guess you took that order personally. Atlas answered by placing one paw over Caleb's wrist. It was not a trained command. It was not something from a manual. It was clumsy, tender, almost accidental. But Caleb broke then. Not loudly. Not in a way that woke the room. His face folded in the dark, and the tears came with no strength behind them, only surrender. He turned slightly toward the wall and pulled Atlas against his chest, careful not to crush the small body that had somehow carried more courage than anyone expected. Stay, Caleb whispered. One word. Barely air. Atlas tucked his head beneath Caleb's chin and stayed. The puppy did not understand rank, grief, deployment, or the long silence that follows a man home when the plane lands and everyone else cheers. He only understood the tremor in Caleb's hand, the salt of tears on skin, the strange duty of warmth. Caleb cried until the storm outside became softer than his breathing. Across the room, Briggs opened his eyes for a moment. He saw the shape of Sergeant Rowe curled around the puppy, saw the chain glinting faintly on the blanket, and understood enough to look away. Some things were not meant to be witnessed loudly. Some rescues happened in the dark and asked for no report. When dawn finally began to pale the windows, Caleb had not slept much, but his face looked less guarded. Atlas remained pressed to him, one ear folded against Caleb's shirt, the other standing crooked and brave. The first whistle had not sounded yet. The bass had not begun its ordered noise. For a few blessed minutes, there was only morning waiting beyond the rain, the smell of wet pine drifting through the screen, and a Marine who had survived another night because a 10-week-old German shepherd refused to let him disappear inside it. The next morning did not fix Caleb Rowe, but it gave him something he had not felt in months, a reason to step into the day before the fear could name him. Rainwater still clung to the edges of the barracks roof, dripping in slow silver beads onto the concrete steps. The air smelled washed clean, full of wet pine, damp earth, and the faint sharpness of coffee drifting from the chow hall. Marines moved through the early light with sleepy discipline, collars straightened, boots laced, voices low before the first full heat of the day. Caleb stood at his locker longer than usual, buttoning his blouse with measured hands while Atlas sat beneath him, watching every movement like it mattered. The puppy's head tilted whenever the dog tag chain brushed Caleb's shirt. Caleb paused, looked down, and for once did not hide the softness in his eyes. "You are on observation," he said quietly. "That does not make you permanent." Atlas yawned, then placed one paw on Caleb's boot. Briggs passed behind them carrying a towel over one shoulder. "Heard that before, Sergeant." Caleb gave him a look. Briggs lifted both hands. "Just making weather observations." Bio 700 hours. Private Atlas was known across half the company, though no official roster admitted it. He followed Caleb to the chow hall and sat outside the door with such patient dignity that 3 Marines came out with bacon they were not supposed to give him. Caleb intercepted all of it, handed Atlas-approved kibble from a paper cup Mara had provided, and ignored the offended look that followed. At the motor pool, Atlas tried to climb into the passenger seat of a Humvee, failed twice, then accepted a boost from Miller with the solemn pride of a promoted officer. Caleb told Miller not to encourage him. Miller said, "Roger that," while scratching Atlas behind the ear. At morning formation, Atlas sat near the edge of the parade deck, crooked ear lifted, tail sweeping the concrete whenever Caleb spoke. No one laughed this time. Not openly. There was something different about the way the men watched Caleb now. They had seen the faint shadow beneath his eyes, but they had also seen him kneel to adjust the puppy's loose bandage. They had seen the careful hand, the quiet patience, the way Atlas leaned toward him without fear. Respect on a base usually came from strength, endurance, rank, or skill. That morning, it came from tenderness nobody had expected to witness. After formation, Mara met Caleb outside the veterinary office with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Sunlight caught in her brown hair, and her expression held the careful kindness of someone about to ask a question with weight inside it. "He can stay here for the full 48 hours, she said. "After that, he will need a placement decision." Caleb kept his eyes on Atlas, who was trying to carry a pine cone and losing the battle with gravity. "Find a good family." Mara nodded slowly. "That is one option." Caleb looked at her then. "What is the other?" She glanced toward the puppy. "Some dogs choose their work before people recognize it. He responded to your distress last night, did he not?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but not with anger. The truth simply stood too close. He looked away toward the parade deck, where the flag moved lightly in the morning breeze. "He is a puppy." "Yes," Mara said. "And he still new." Caleb said nothing. The day stretched on, warm and ordinary, but ordinary felt different now. Atlas followed him through small tasks and quiet errands, tripping once over a hose, falling asleep during paperwork, waking the moment Caleb shifted too abruptly. Each time Caleb's breathing changed, Atlas noticed. Each time Caleb reached for the chain beneath his shirt, Atlas came closer. By late afternoon, Caleb stopped pretending not to see it. He sat on the barracks steps with a paper cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and Atlas settled against his boot like the world had always been arranged that way. The base moved around them in golden light, voices, engines, footsteps, laughter from somewhere near the laundry room. Caleb rubbed one thumb along the puppy's ear and looked out across the grounds he had walked like a ghost only yesterday. He was not healed. The nights would still come. The memories would still knock. But beside his boot sat a tiny German shepherd who had learned the sound of his fear and answered it with warmth. For Caleb, that was not small. That was the first mercy. The 48 hours ended beneath a clean Carolina sky. Morning light spread over Camp Lejeune in soft gold, touching the parade deck, the flagpole, the rows of low brick buildings, and the wet grass still shining from the week's rain. Caleb Rowe stood outside the veterinary office with his hands at his sides, trying to look like a man waiting for paperwork instead of a decision that had somehow found its way beneath his ribs. Atlas sat beside his left boot, cleaner now after Mara's careful brushing, though one ear still leaned sideways with brave imperfection. Around his neck was a simple temporary collar, plain blue nylon, far too big until Mara had adjusted it twice. The puppy looked smaller than ever against the wide base, but he sat like he had been assigned to guard the entire morning. Mara stepped out carrying a clipboard and a small folded patch in her palm. Miller, Briggs, and a handful of Marines had gathered nearby under the polite excuse of having business in the area. No one admitted they were there for Atlas. No one needed to. Mara looked at Caleb. No owner came forward. He is healthy. He is adoptable. And given what happened, I submitted a recommendation for him to remain under base foster care while he begins evaluation for support training. Caleb stared at the puppy. Atlas stared back, tail tapping once against the concrete. Support training, Caleb repeated. Mara nodded. He may never be a working dog in the traditional sense. He is too young to know. But some gifts show up early. Briggs cleared his throat. Permission to say something unofficial, Sergeant? Caleb did not look at him. Denied. Briggs said it anyway. He already has a job. A quiet smile moved through the group. Caleb should have corrected him. Instead, he crouched in front of Atlas. The puppy immediately leaned forward and placed both paws on Caleb's knee, as if they had rehearsed this all their lives. Mara unfolded the patch. It was small, dark, and neatly stitched with 2 words in white thread, Night Watch. Caleb looked at it for a long moment, then took it carefully, his thumb passing over the letters. Something in his face shifted, not breaking, not hiding, just opening enough for morning to get in. He attached the patch to Atlas's collar while the puppy held perfectly still, solemn for once, as if he understood that this was not a game. When Caleb finished, he rested his hand against Atlas's chest and felt the small heartbeat beneath his fingers. You were never just following me, he whispered. You were bringing me back. Atlas licked his wrist. The Marines laughed softly, and this time Caleb laughed with them, one short breath of sound that surprised everyone, maybe him most of all. Then his eyes filled. He did not turn away. He let the tears come quietly in the sunlight, with his hand still on the puppy's collar and Daniel's dog tag resting warm beneath his shirt. No one spoke. Even the base seemed to hold still for those few seconds, the flag moving gently overhead, the wind carrying the smell of pine and fresh coffee across the morning. Later, Caleb and Atlas walked back across the parade deck together. The puppy bounced more than walked, patch crooked, tail high, paws too big for his body. Caleb's stride was still measured, still marine, but not as lonely. At the edge of the barracks, Atlas stopped and looked up at him, waiting. Caleb opened the door. Come on, Night Watch, he said. And as they stepped inside, the light followed them.